I see Francisco and David with jackets on. I got my jacket right there, but then I see Elias kind of a little more casual, and I'm like, this is Zoom, so I think I'm gonna stay jacket
Yeah, I
off.
don't know.
Oh, he's got the yes, David has a I did the same thing. I got the tie and the jacket just in case you all showed up in force. All right, so let me wait until I get so I see the recording on. And I suspect we're in a good place. So gentlemen, let's get started. So it's still morning. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our session today. I'm Brian Fonseca, Director of Florida International University's Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, and I'm honored to serve as your moderator for today's discussion. We have three thoughtful people here joining us to parse through some really complex issues. I wanted to take the opportunity up front to provide, or offer rather, some thoughts to help frame today's discussion. In recent years, including the last few months, and even more specific, the last several days, if you're following Twitter, U.S. foreign policy seems caught between two competing instincts. Strategic engagement, think of Iran, Syria, even North Korea during the first Trump administration, and the other of principled isolation. And that's not to say that isolation can't be strategic or engagement can't be principled, but still, nowhere is this tension more visible or more consequential to American strategic interest than in our approach to Venezuela. Venezuela presents a complex case. It's governed by an autocratic and repressive regime. I don't think many can argue that. And yet, U.S. leverage on the ground is incredibly limited to affect policy outcomes, whether that's through official government channels or non-state actors such as private sector and civil society organizations. And I think this creates a policy paradox, one where withdrawal and moral clarity may feel satisfying, but in practice, it's likely to cede more space to actors like China, Russia, and Iran that may pose significant challenges to American strategic interests more broadly. The risk of disengagement isn't theoretical, and as I've argued before in publications and congressional testimonies, stepping back doesn't mean others will follow necessarily. It means others may step in. We've seen this before, even closer to home. Another country that my community is incredibly passionate about, the Cold War, or Cuba. The Cold War era isolation of Cuba did not collapse the Castro regime. Instead, it turned a small Caribbean island into a satellite for Soviet global operations. Venezuela is not Cuba. I want to be very clear about that, and that should be clear to policymakers too. It's vastly larger, possesses significant mineral and energy wealth, and occupies a more central role today in hemispheric dynamics. Its trajectory matters, not just for democracy in the region, but for U.S. strategic interests globally. This is a passionate issue with strong views on all sides, but we must be clear-eyed. If our policy is engagement, we must ask how we use our tools, diplomacy, targeted incentives, multilateral coordination, to foster a path back to democratic governance. If our policy is isolation, we must ask how we prevent our geopolitical competitors from becoming Venezuela's economic and security lifeline. Ultimately, this isn't just a Venezuela question. It's a test of how the U.S. navigates a world where authoritarian resilience and strategic competition are reshaping global norms. And so to parse this discussion, we've asked three experts to join us here at the university, virtually albeit, to help discuss some of the complexities around American foreign policy towards Venezuela. I've had the opportunity to follow these three, of which are prolific thinkers and writers in the space. First, we have Francisco Minaldi. He's the Wallace S. Wilson Fellow in Latin American Energy Policy and Director of the Latin America Energy Program at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He also lectures at Rice University's Economics Department, Jones Graduate School of Business, and is affiliated with Columbia University's Center for Global Energy Policy. I just had the opportunity to talk or present with Francisco in Santiago, Chile, not too long ago, talking about some of the complex issues of American foreign policy in the region. So grateful to have Francisco here. Elias is founder and director of the Orinoco Research. It's an intelligence service that supports foreign investors with exposure in Venezuela. He's been a regular contributor to the energy section of Forbes and has written articles for a range of international publications, including Financial Times, the European, and El Confidencial, among many others. And so it's great to have his perspectives woven into this conversation as well. And last, and of course, certainly not least, David Goldwyn, who has been a regular in sort of this thought leadership around U.S. policy towards Venezuela. He's president of Goldwyn Global Strategies and chairman of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center's Energy Advisory Group. He's a leading expert on energy security and transparency. He previously served as the U.S. State Department's Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Affairs from 2009 to 2011, and Assistant Secretary of Energy for International Affairs from 1999 to 2001. He's the only person to hold both top international energy roles in the U.S. government. And so, David, I appreciate you being here as well. And so let's jump right in. And I'm going to ask our speakers to provide 7 minutes worth of opening remarks discussing the sort of challenges of American foreign policy at this particular juncture relative to Venezuela. I've offered a series of questions to them, but certainly the floor is theirs to talk about the things they're passionate about relative to the subject. I'm going to start with Francisco and then Elias, and then we'll conclude with David. Then I'll drive a conversation for about 30 minutes. I have some questions in my back pocket ready to go to kind of parse this even more. And then after that, I'll welcome comments or questions in the Q&A box that I can weave into the discussion for the remaining 30 minutes. And so for those joining, feel free to go into the Q&A and start typing questions away, and I'll do my best to weave as many of those questions representing all perspectives into the conversation once we get towards that portion of the discussion. And so with that, Francisco, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and happy to be again working together with Florida International University. I thought I could lay a little bit the lay of the land in terms of some facts that are really relevant for this discussion. The first thing is to remind everyone that until the cancellation of licenses in the last few months in Venezuela, the Biden administration had given licenses, 3 types of licenses, right? 3 to production licenses to Chevron, Repsol, and Morel and Prom, which are companies that produce oil in Venezuela. And these companies were given by PDVSA a special type of contract that allowed them to operate the oil fields. Then we had a license to purchase oil, but basically Reliance, Global Oil Terminals, ENI, and others. Repsol also has one of those, or swap or buy. And finally, some licenses for projects to export gas to Trinidad. And all of these licenses have been canceled. And by the way, there was another one, which was just to remain their assets in the country. The service providers, Schlumberger, Baker Hughes, etc., had a license, but it was very limited. And that one was let to expire the last few days. So bottom line, all of these licenses have expired, except for, have been announced to be expired, except as, very timely, we are discussing this, on Tuesday, theoretically, the licenses to the production licenses are gonna end. And of course, we know that the events in the last few days, there has been a lot of back and forth about what is exactly gonna happen. And the 3 scenarios are an extension of the wind down, another type of license, which could be more flexible or more restrictive, like the one that the service companies had, and of course, nothing, just ending the licenses. Just to give you an idea of how things are, what is happening in the sector. Venezuela in the first quarter produced around 940,000 barrels of oil per day. There are different figures, the official and other estimates, but that's sort of the figure that I think it's the most closest to the reality. And of that, about half was produced by PDVSA, a quarter by Chevron, the Russians and the Chinese together about 21%, and then the Europeans about 4 to 5%. In terms of exports during the first quarter, we had exports of about 850,000 barrels. 55% of those went to China, mostly to the black market, although a little bit to the national oil companies of China. 30% went to the US, 11% to Europe and India combined, and the remaining about 4% to Cuba, which is significantly lower than before some of these licenses. in April, as the U.S. announced the wind down, and particularly when Chevron was stopped from taking cargoes, there has been a decline in exports. That it's too early to say, what is the exact, what is exactly going to happen in that regard, because exports are very volatile, and we have a decline in production, a slight decline in production. If licenses are fully revoked, I expect production to decline by about 100 to 150,000 barrels in the following few months, because of a combination of, PDVSA will take over the projects of the private companies, but they will have issues with diluents. They will not have the investments that Chevron, Repsol, and Morel and Prom were doing it, and they will have trouble operating the upgraders in the Orinoco Belt. Other estimates are higher, a few are lower. It's hard to say what exactly would happen. Rerouting, about 40% of the current exports are going to license destinies that are now having to go to the black market, is going to be relatively tough for the government, because first of all, the Chinese market is at this point not growing in terms of imports. It has a lot of competition from Russia and Iran in that black market, and of course the threat of secondary tariffs by the Trump administration, which the Chinese have been very clearly saying, we are not going to cave in, we are not going to accept any of these type of threats. And I don't think it's a credible threat in many ways, but I do think that probably we'll get some of the independent refiners a little bit more careful. They will require, some of the smaller ones will require a larger discount, and so Venezuela will have a little bit of more difficulty selling there. So the net effect of all that is that the Venezuelan government will receive less revenues, even though they will not pay the debts to Repsol, Morel and Prom, ENI that they were paying. They will face this decline in production plus bigger discount. So overall, I think it's safe to say that the most likely scenario is a decline in revenues, and that will lead to higher inflation, as it's already happening, a devaluation, and probably a recession. Venezuela recently announced that they have signed new deals with about 9 different companies and new type of contracts. They had signed some of these before, but very similar ones. I think most of these are unlikely to fly without licenses. There are a few which are with American companies, and those clearly without licenses are not going to fly. Perhaps there is one with a China Concord company, which is a trader that works in the black market. So they might be willing to invest a little bit, but I doubt that there will be significant investment. So at this point, we might be even surprised by a tweet in the middle of our panel, and something might change, but it seems that it's not settled. The policy regarding this topic is not settled in the Trump administration. Particularly in the long term, it's unclear what will happen in the long term. But I think that it's safe to say that if everything continues like the status quo today of the expiration of licenses, that's what we will see. And I just wanted to finish saying that in any case, a significant recovery of the Venezuelan oil sector will not happen, even under an extension of licenses, because there are many other obstacles that have led to a decline in oil production in Venezuela, starting by the lack of credibility of the institutional environment. And there is not even a law at this point that really establishes this contract, and a very terrible track record of the Venezuelan government respecting any type of deal. So for that reason, I am not bullish at all that the Venezuelan oil production is going to significantly increase. And if you see all the estimates of all the oil, the best oil consultants, in fact, they are more pessimistic than I am. So overall, I think that's the most likely scenario right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Francisco. And if you're all wondering what Francisco's referring to in Twitter sphere, it was Steve Bannon's interview with Rick Grinnell saying an extension would occur. Secretary Marco Rubio shutting that down on X, saying it wasn't going to happen. Laura Loomer then coming over the top on that as well. And so, again, a lot of drama unfolding around what the U.S. approach would be, almost seemingly appearing, very schizophrenic at this point, not sure which direction the policy is going to go. Whether that's by design or not, don't know, but it certainly is evolving, quite rapidly.
I think they were promoting our panel, Brian.
I think so. It was a perfect lead up to it. Now I'm hoping we get some answers after our panel, and hopefully the panel helps inform what those answers are. Thanks, Francisco. Elias, all right, we're going to go over to you. So if you can provide some opening remarks, go for it.
Yeah, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to go on some points more on the impact on the ground of these licenses. So, I mean, the main idea of doing these sanctions was to cause regime change, at least initially, and we see that, I mean, it's not happening, and it's very unlikely to happen as we keep having sanctions over time. I mean, if you look at plenty of other countries like Cuba and Iran, it doesn't really, it kind of like props up the regime more than kick them out. But then so what happens with the economy? And I've seen quite a few reports now that about 40% of the hard currency that you see that is settled in the foreign exchange market here in Venezuela comes from Chevron, and an additional 10% comes from other, let's say like Western aligned oil companies like European, Indian, and so on. And then remittances are the other big source I'm talking about the private foreign exchange market. Like other things like foreign investment are basically like, it doesn't exist. It's like 50 million a year or something like that. It's nothing. So really we have a private foreign exchange market that is propped up by these dollars that Chevron brings in. So this is really going to have a big effect for the private sector. Also, there's going to be another effect in terms of jobs, contracts with service providers in the local area. But I think the lack of dollars is going to be the main thing, because what's going to happen if PDVSA sells this oil on their own, they're going to sell it for less with a bigger discount, as Monaldi said, but they're going to take the dollars directly, whereas Chevron would be selling this oil, getting the dollars, and then because of the licenses, because of the specifics of them, they had to change it into the local currency, into bolivars, and pay taxes, royalties, and service providers and all that in the local bolivars. So yeah, it is going to be a really big effect for banks, which there's no credit, there's no financial services. So that's the only thing that they had. And also a lot of companies that have to import, and they really needed those dollars. I mean, we're probably going to see a really big spike in inflation and a further devaluation of the bolivar. We're already seeing that, and it's kind of like people expecting that to happen is making it happen already. And yeah, and as Monaldi said, like exports aren't going to stop. They might change a bit. Many companies will probably be wary, and they will ask for bigger discounts. Some of them will stop. Eventually, you always have a buyer for oil. It's kind of like a drug. Like there will always be a buyer, but in which conditions, right? Like, are they going to be scared? They're going to ask for a bigger discount. You're only going to have you're going to have like a smaller range of buyers, so it's going to be harder. But I mean, we see how like the US keeps sanctioning oil producers, so that whole global sector, the whole I mean, all of those shadow fleets and all of those intermediaries, they keep getting a bigger share of the market over time. And we've got like Russia, Iran. I mean, Russia is like what, like 9-10 million barrels per day. That's like such a massive market. You can't just turn it offline from one day to the other. And yeah, so we also see this kind of rapprochement, this kind of like coming back together of the Venezuelan government with China, Russia, Iran. We actually have a high-level delegation from Iran coming up soon. And yeah, that's really interesting because we don't know what they're speaking about. I mean, they never say it. They just say, oh, like we're doing economic cooperation and technological cooperation, and then you're like, okay, what does that mean? You don't really know, but then you start seeing here and there new companies coming in, and we've seen that in refineries, especially with Iran, and then we also seen when this thing has been coming on Twitter, these smaller Chinese private companies. There's about three of them that I know of right now. China Conquer Petroleum is the most famous one, and they're doing this thing, this kind of production sharing agreements, which is really interesting. Because as Monande said, there are a lot of obstacles inside Venezuela to produce oil. The joint venture model that most companies had is unprofitable. So Chevron was able to get like a special deal, and Repsol and all these other companies, they were able to get like exceptions made to that because they had a license. But now these companies coming in with a production sharing agreement, they don't become shareholders in the joint venture. They do kind of like a service contract, but they have many of these really good conditions under a really special anti-blockade law that allows you to make all kinds of exceptions. So I think that's going to be really interesting. There's also zero transparency, and that's the whole point of this anti-blockade law. So that, I mean, you don't know what's in the contract, unlike in the joint ventures. So yeah, we're kind of hearing about these Chinese companies coming in, but you basically have to speak to people working in them to figure it out. Because I mean, it's not in any kind of government paper or any kind of like official statement. And then to end with, I wanted to talk a little bit about like some question that I've seen out there, which is like, what happens to Chevron if they leave for a second time, right? If they get sanctioned for a second time, and they're shareholder in a joint venture, so you can't just kick them out straight away. I mean, that would be like a really big problem. But PDVSA is the majority shareholder. It's just going to keep going. It's going to keep operating, probably without the same investment, the same inputs, without the same talent, but it's going to keep going. Probably it's going to be able to keep most of the production going. And also, the Venezuelan government can give production sharing agreements to other companies for the same joint venture, which I think is really interesting. So technically, they could give it to a Chinese company because one of them, for example, is working in. I mean, funny enough, is working in joint ventures with a Belarusian state-owned company. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it there, and let's see what David has to say.
No, thanks, Elias. I appreciate that. And I'm glad you brought up Iran. I'm probably going to come back to you on Iran a little later on. I remember sort of the Chavez Ahmadinejad bromance that sort of blossomed when Iran really started to make its way. And it's interesting, a lot of the advocates for, one particular side of the policy discourse today we're also very much, sort of leveraging that opening with Venezuela and Iran to sort of advocate a more interventionist policy a decade, 15 years ago, 15, 20 years ago at this point, when Ahmadinejad and Venezuela, the then Iran tractor factory and the direct flights and all of that. So it'd be interesting to kind of parse that out since you brought it up. And I'm also going to probably ask you to go a little deeper in terms of some of the social impacts on the ground of sort of the policy. But before we do that, David, I'd love to give the floor to you and kind of hear your perspectives on this.
Great. Well, thanks, Brian. It's great to be here virtually with Florida International University, and really always a joy to be on a panel with Francisco, and good to meet Elias as well. I think my two colleagues have characterized things pretty well. U.S.-Venezuela policy has been a pendulum swing really from January of this year. We started with Rick Grenell saying diplomacy is back, and it was clear the administration was going to focus on normalizing migration and perhaps leveraging resources down there on the way to talking about a democratic transition. And then congressional politics intervened. In the first round, where the Republicans were trying to get instructions on the budget agreement, 3 members of the Florida delegation said, "Not unless you shift Venezuela policy." Grenell was out, and the threat was back in. And then we saw really just very recently, Secretary Wright saying president wants to force change. And then we saw this rumor of a 60-day extension. When Grinnell was going to get hostages released, which he did, and regularize migration and talk about resources. And then the Florida delegation was back last night in what ended up being a 215 to 214 vote. So every vote did count. And so the policy is back swinging to the hardliners versus the pragmatists. I think I agree with Brian. I think what you said at the outset. I think this is temporary. I think this is the policy of the day. I think what we've learned from this is that not only the pragmatists like Rick Grinnell, but the president himself, I think, is pretty clear in understanding that maximum pressure did not work. It did not force Maduro from power. It let the Russians and the Iranians back in. It essentially provided China with subsidized oil. And that isolation really was very adverse to U.S. interests. So going back again is not going to be productive. I also think he's got an eye on Venezuela's resources. I mean, both the minerals as well as the oil. And it's a whole lot bigger than Greenland, in terms of attractiveness. So I don't think those interests have gone away. I think they are just sidelined for now. And that's because the tax cut comes first. In terms of what happens next, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that, we saw this movement with maximum pressure one, and the results are going to be pretty predictable. I think first is, as I think both Francisco and Elias have said, we have learned that isolation doesn't stop production, and it doesn't stop exports. It just redirects them. And so, yes, with a lack of capital, there will be 5 to 10% decrease in production because they're not able to do maintenance. But exports will continue. And the agreements that Elias referred to, I think they're called productive participation contracts, CPPs. These are really hybrids of service agreements and production sharing agreements. So you hire an entity, and they provide the capex and the opex to keep a production going. In the oil sector, they get 50% of what they produce in kind. That's the production sharing part of it. And they get to trade that and sell that. PDVSA gets paid in oil as well, which it can then sell for cash without all the transparency provisions and requirements of the current licensing regime. But you're not nationalizing the asset, I think, as Elias said. And right now, I think, this is a model that's already operating. I think the Chinese have signed CPPs for productive potential of 290,000 barrels a day. Doesn't mean they're producing that amount, but that potential. So it's clear they can sustain production through these arrangements with countries, with companies that are willing to do this. So that was the first lesson. The second lesson we learned was that that destroying the economy leads to massive migration. And our colleague Francisco Rodriguez, University of Denver, has done really fantastic research on this, showing not the correlation, but truly cause and effect between economic privation and migration. And I think he predicted, on top of 800,000 migrants that might leave over the next 5 years, it would be up to 1 million, over the next 5 years if we went back to maximum pressure. And so we're going to see that pretty quickly. And I think, as Elias has pointed out, foreign exchange access to dollars is already down by half, which means they're going to print more bolivars, which means inflation is going to go up. So we're already on that path to destroying the economy, and with a net back of somewhere between $28 and $32 a barrel, which is what I think that Chinese discount and having the Chinese be the only buyers in town will get them. We're gonna see a return of that as well. The third lesson that we learned was that U.S. interests were poorly served by maximum pressure, and I think this has been covered pretty well. But the primary thing we did was subsidize the Chinese economy, because you provided China with all of that oil, and they were the only buyer, and they got $30 a barrel discount or more. And then you saw the Iranians providing diluent, and the Russians basically buying crude and then reselling it. So we got the migration into the U.S. We got all of our adversaries basically empowered and losing influence. So this is already happening just with the threat of the expiration of the licenses. So I got my statistics from IPD Latin America, but I mean, they're showing Venezuelan crude output has pretty much remained steady through April 2025. Crude exports to China have been rising from about 277,000 barrels a day in the November to January period to 450,000 barrels a day between February and April. Exports to the Atlantic Basin are already down. It was about 223,000 barrels a day in March, 113,000 in April, and expected to be about 80,000 in May. So, and as I think all of you have said, China is unfazed by the threat of secondary tariffs. And there are, in fact, a fleet of tankers offshore Jose right now, all of them with their AIS transponders turned off, waiting to pick up that Venezuelan crude. And frankly, I think they're just waiting to negotiate a better price once they were certain that they would be the only game in town. So China's already benefiting from threatened U.S. sanctions, and we've seen Maduro cozying up to Putin and President Xi, in his May 10th visit to Moscow. The last thing I'd say, and I think Elias covered this well, is that we have learned historically and in Venezuela that isolating the economy does not lead to the removal of Maduro. And in fact, it's been, it's a hard problem. It's always an impulse to use sanctions because it's the hammer that you've got when you've got a regime that you don't like. But the lesson is the more important the government is to the economy, the more control it has. So we saw in Maximum Pressure One is the government controlled diesel, the government controlled power, the government controlled food, they controlled petrol. So you don't get to do anything unless you are beholden to the government. The more you privatize the economy, the more assets that are in the hands of the private sector, the more freedom of action you have. The other thing, and I think Cuba is a great example that we've learned, is that if you drive the middle class out of a country, who is left to foment a transition and democratic reform? So, this has failed spectacularly before. And in fact, I think you have to say that the apex of the salience and the power of the opposition forces came from this sanctions for democratic transition steps, which gave you an election, even if it was stolen, allowed the campaigning by Maria Corina Machado and the eventual president, but they got salience. They showed the world how little power or how little, frankly, popularity Maduro had and how much they had. So that was all as a result of this. And so, I think none of that would have been possible without that sanctions relief. So what we're looking at right now, I think, are predictable results. And so the question is, how do you prevent these assets from being handed over to the Venezuelans? And so I think one of the things that's been alluded to is the US government, if they're going to go this route of allowing these licenses to expire, they need a license like we had before with, I think it was GL8, where you at least allow the companies to protect their assets, to keep some people in there and have an eye on what's going on rather than hand it back. They might even consider doing swaps and things which don't provide cash to the government itself. And the other piece they need is a diplomatic strategy. And we can come back to this in the Q&A, but even the first Trump administration envisioned a democratic transition strategy which leveraged kinds of sanctions relief for democratic transition. Kind of overreached with that. We can talk about what it can happen, but you're not going to get the thing which is theoretically the objective of the strategy, which is a democratic transition without diplomacy. And so we can come back to that, but I think there's room for that. But in the meantime, if it's going to go this way and it's not going to be a handover of these assets, the U.S. government needs at least to license the ability of the companies to look after their assets. So let me leave it there.
David, thank you for that. So I got questions for all three of you, but I do want to ask one sort of broad question to start, simply because I think you've all touched on it. And it's certainly one of the counter arguments to engagement is really about sort of the financing of the Maduro regime. And so my question is really about sort of, if Western companies in the United States are out and PDVSA continues to produce and export oil, which it will, with the support of others that are willing to help Venezuela around, sort of a withdrawal from Western companies, will the regime actually make more money or have more control of that money than under a sort of model that the U.S. has greater control over influencing? Because that's the argument. The argument is if you keep Western companies on there, it's going to continue to funnel money to Maduro. The question is, if the U.S. is out, the Western is out, doesn't mean money is not going to funnel to the regime. Maybe the regime actually has more equity or control over that. Can you guys touch on that? Am I wrong on that? What do you think? Does this solve that problem of financing what we all, I think, agree is an autocratic and repressive regime?
I'm happy to jump into that one first. I mean, I think it's a couple things. First, they will have more control because they're going to be able to sell directly for hard currency in a way that they are not right now. They get bolivars, as Elias pointed out, and 50% of every dollar goes to debt repayment and to reinvestment. So they'll get 100% of the proceeds, and they'll get it in hard currency. They're going to get significantly lower netback because they're only going to have one buyer, and because the price of oil is lower than it has been. So that's going to be a factor as well. So I think they're going to have more control, more access to cash than they do right now. But in terms of the total netback, I mean, it really depends on on where the price of oil goes.
I think that it depends. On the one hand, you will not be paying the 20% that you pay to Chevron, Repsol, and Morel and Prom, but at the same time, they will take the exports from the projects that these three companies are doing, will send it to the black market, and they, of course, will not pay the companies at all. As we had, by the way, an experience with this during the period between 2020 and 2022, when something very similar was in place. And basically, they accumulated a very significant debt with these foreign companies, but they did sell in the black market. It's hard to know, besides the discount that I think will increase, and therefore I think the total revenue will be lower. There is another element that is hard to assess because it's so opaque compared to the flows that we can see a little bit. We have more visibility coming from the U.S. and European markets, which is the following. During the El Aissami public firing, etc., we saw internal audits that were published in the press that basically showed that a significant portion of the exports to China, they had not been able to collect on them. And most of the others were done through barter system. And so that tells you that probably they got much less than they expected. And in particular, we know that they received only a fraction in actual currency. So the theory, at least from what I can gather, is that they have improved on their capacity to collect from the black market. But it's still unclear, how much of every dollar, let's put it, of every barrel that they build, how much do they actually get back? How fast do they get it back? The evidence seems to show from the money that they seem to bring to the government, to the country, that they do get a significant amount back, but it's very hard to assess. So bottom line, are they going to get less money? I think they're going to get less money, but it's unclear what will be the. And by the way, the reason why the markets are, while the currency is devaluing, and why all the economies are predicting now a recession, is precisely because they think that that's the case. By the way, as I mentioned, I have one of the lowest estimates of decline of oil production compared to others, but still with the one that I have, if you add the higher discounts, you get a recession.
I think just very quickly on this, I think that the main thing to consider is, the states will kind of get a similar amount because it's like a bigger share of a smaller pie. So you have that, but then there's going to be a really big impact on the private sector, which is not going to get those dollars in the private exchange market. So overall, Venezuela will have less money. So Venezuela is going to go into a recession, into hyperinflation and all those things, even if the state makes kind of the same, a bit less, a bit more by selling directly, but then some of it is going to be through barter and all that.
Thanks, Elias. So Elias, let me stick with you then on a question that sort of your comments raised for me, which is really about the social aspect of where the economy is going. And so again, many have argued that the spirit of sanctions was really to create enough social, social issues that it led to sort of a bleeding up and a potential, rebellion against the regime to displace the regime, right? And then there have been different arguments out there about, how the sanctions are related to the humanitarian crisis directly. Can you talk a little bit about, as you talk about, recession, rising inflation, the economic conditions that are in process now, how will that further fuel or challenge some of the social and humanitarian issues on the ground in Venezuela? And what are your thoughts in terms of how an American policy could help reframe some of that?
Yeah, so obviously the original idea was, so the economy was collapsing, and the idea was to like help it collapse even more. So then people get angry. I mean, they're already protesting, and there was riots and everything. So it was already. I mean, I don't know why they thought they needed to push it even like deeper, because it was already kind of everything was like going wrong. People were out on the streets. But anyway, that was the idea, to like make it even worse, so people are even angrier and they rebel and they overthrow the government. That hasn't worked, and now the economy has like improved since. So it's not as good as before the economic collapse, but it has improved since the very bottom. And then, so the idea that like bringing it back to the bottom is gonna, this time around, is actually gonna cause a rebellion. I mean, I don't really see it. And actually, there's been quite a few polls out there where people don't really have an expectation, or they don't really have hopes for political change. I mean, especially, so we had this presidential election in July. It was stolen in the most like blatant way possible. There was a protest. About 30 protesters were killed, basically, in that period. And the opposition leadership at that time wasn't able to like give any answers or have any accountability. So people aren't really thinking about, according to this post, they aren't thinking about like a possibility of political change in the short term. So that means is that they're not thinking about rebelling, protesting, and what they're thinking is, okay, the economy is going to go down the drain again. I'm just going to leave. And depends on each poll. They will give you slightly different numbers, but we're really talking about 3 to 5 million people who are considering leaving Venezuela, emigrating. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to just take their suitcase and leave next month. But it does point out that the way Venezuelans are underground are coping with the situation is kind of more like, okay, this is hopeless economically and politically, so I'm just gonna quit. And then also this figure is like 40% for under 30s. So like for young people is massive. Like young people are just saying, I'm gonna leave this country, and in a very large number. So there's kind of like the social and impact that I'm seeing. And also, I mean, I'm here in Caracas, and that's how most people that I know are thinking about it. I mean, there's an election coming up on Sunday. Most people are not going to vote. They don't really see politics as a solution.
Thanks, Elias. And I think the spirit of that also, I mean, the the regime's response by design was to push people out of the country as part of a pressure release valve. We saw that in Cuba, decades ago, that when you had this sort of social uprising kind of manifesting, most people would prefer to leave than fight. And so, by design, creating that pressure release valve in which the 7+ million people, fled over the last, period of humanitarian crisis, I think is more consistent with what kind of you're suggesting, as opposed to staying and fighting, and now much of the fight is happening outside, right, as opposed to sort of the spirit of that which was inside. So I appreciate that. Francisco, I want to come over to you and ask about one of the biggest challenges for the Venezuelan economy has always been its inability to diversify away from energy as its main prominent source of revenue, and that dates back long before Maduro and so forth. And and you had the economy almost 90+% predicated on sort of the energy sector. And we've seen since at least Maduro's tenure a drop from what 1.3 million roughly million barrels per day down to where it's at now. What would it take for the Venezuelan oil sector to sort of bounce back, to fully, develop its potential, and not just from sort of an infrastructure and investment perspective, but also a time period? What would that look like?
Sure. So just to remind you of some facts, Venezuela produced about 3.4 million barrels when Chavez came into power. When Chavez died and Maduro got into power, they produced about 2.7 million barrels. When sanctions started, sanctions to PDVSA themselves, some financial sanctions had been enacted before, but to PDVSA is the figure that you mentioned, 1.3 million barrels. And then it went down spectacularly to less than 400,000 barrels and then bounced back. And this is, I think, something important to realize. The collapse was not a collapse of production in that period, but mostly a collapse of the market because of COVID. So they couldn't sell the barrels, and the price, in the black market of Venezuelan oil reached a level in which it didn't even cover production costs. So they closed a lot of oil wells during that period. And as the market came back, the Iranians held them in the black market, and they started getting supplies of diluent from Iran. They were able to recover pretty quickly until they got to until the spare capacity sort of disappeared, and they needed new investment. And that's when the production stagnated in 2022 until Chevron started to investing, and then you see an increase again. It's important to understand that the Chevron investment and Chevron project is very unique, right? Because Chevron was one of the biggest players in the country. And so immediately they reopened one of the fields, Boscan, that was not being able to sell production in the black market, and started sending this oil to the US. So they recovered from about 70,000 barrels to about 100 and something very quickly. Today they are producing about 230, so a significant increase. But that was done, all the investments was done with the cash flow coming from those exports to the US. So Chevron was not risking $1 additional dollar in Venezuela. So that is a big difference with many of other potential projects that will not have that initial cash flow to invest. They will be risking much more. And in addition, the problem is that PDVSA cannot, except for maybe one project in the Golfo de Paria in which ENI is involved, cannot guarantee anyone, because they have to mix their oil with PDVSA's oil to bring it to the terminal. And so in the end, it's PDVSA deciding if they give you a cargo or not. That's the bottom line. And so nobody can get what Chevron got, except perhaps this ENI project, but that requires a lot of investment. And ENI, for a variety of reasons, might not be doing it even with a license, although we don't know. So what would it take to get? Venezuela requires $80 billion of investment over a period of about 7 years to get production back to, say, 2.2 million barrels of oil, and even much more to get it back to 3 million barrels. By the way, Venezuela, the counterfactual of what Venezuela should be producing today is about between 4 and 5 million barrels of oil if the plans that the private companies had been enacted, and also some of the PDVSA plans. So I don't think we will see at all a crash of production like the one we saw in 2020, because there is no COVID, and the price of oil, I think, even though, by the way, one problem that they do have, and David did mention it, is that the price of oil is declining as we speak, right? Regardless of all these other things happening. And so when you have to give significant discounts, it does matter that the price is high enough so to make it attractive. I mean, if the price for some reason crashed to $30, that would be really, really bad for Maduro and for Venezuela. So just to close, the conditions that are required to me are credibility and a new law in Venezuela, a new institutional framework, not this kind of obscure anti-blockade law that doesn't provide any long-term certainty. And more importantly, the perception that there's going to be a integration of Venezuela with a long-lasting integration of Venezuela with the international community, meaning that, there is not going to be another government putting some types of sanctions. And that's why I don't think we will see a recovery of the oil sector unless there is regime change and an institutional change. It could be that even if there is regime change, if they don't do the things needed to attract foreign investment, they will not get much. And with this type of contract that they are putting, I mean, they have tried this like 5 different ways, 5 different times. These type of contracts are going to perhaps get some minor investment by some companies, but not the significant investments that are needed. And by the way, many of them have been signed with American companies. And so these are not going to fly without a license. But even if there was a license, I don't think they will get significant enough investments. These are not like Chevron's projects.
Thanks, Francisco. I'm gonna ask another question for you and for David, and sort of as a 2-part, so you guys can hopefully capture both of it. On one end, because you mentioned sort of the state of affairs and where it's going, but we hear a lot of talk about the role China and Russia and their national oil companies are having in Venezuela. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of that element? What are those countries doing in terms of investing, engaging in Venezuelan oil sector? What is that likely to do as our policy continues to sort of be challenged going forward? That's part one. Part two, which is something I noted in a congressional testimony almost 5-6 years ago, is that I think Russia to some degree also benefits from Venezuelan oil in the ground in terms of supply, demand dynamics. Elias pointed out Russia's producing almost 11 million barrels per day, and I think about 8 plus of that is surplus, which is for export market, and that means that they have a significant amount of oil to move into the global market. And so Venezuelan oil, which is a competitor to Russian oil in the ground, could fetch more for Russian oil. Is that dynamic also something that you see kind of in the thinking of Russia as it approaches Venezuela?
I think, Brian, that you are right to point out there is a very significant difference between Russia and China regarding their role in the Venezuelan oil industry, because Russia is a competitor of Venezuela, and they do benefit from the collapse of Venezuelan oil production. Of course, if there is any production, they prefer to do it themselves, but overall, they are not in the business of helping Venezuela increase production. If they're going to make money out of it, might be a different proposition, but still. China, on the other hand, seemed for a long while like the perfect marriage for Venezuela, right? The country with the largest oil imports in the world, appetite for oil that was growing dramatically, and Venezuela, the country with such large resources. But I have to say, the Chinese, when Chavez died, they stopped giving almost any credit to Venezuela, just extending a little bit longer some credit lines, but not giving any fresh money. And they have not invested in the oil sector in Venezuela for more than a decade. They, at some point in time, signaled that they might in the Sinovenza project, but PDVSA didn't put any money and they got fed up. Then, with the sanctions, the Chinese have been very, very unwilling to put any additional money. I'm talking about the national company, CNPC. It could be a different story with players like these black market Chinese players that might be willing to do something. But also China is changing. China's appetite for oil is decreasing. They have a lot of EV penetration. They have all this access to these other black market suppliers. So I don't think for China is that important anymore. Of course, Venezuela is a geopolitical ally of China. They do like to create trouble for the US in their backyard. And so I don't think they will give up by any means on Maduro, but I don't think And all my interactions with the national companies of China tells me that they are not going to risk a significant amount of money. In the case of Russia, it's even worse because they, on the one hand, are occupied with, as you know, with a lot of other bigger issues, and the cash flow or the capital that they have available, they prefer to invest in Russia itself rather than in Venezuela. So nevertheless, the Russians are still there. They produce about 11% of Venezuela's production, and it goes to the black market, and the Chinese about 10%. So the question, I think, is, are the Chinese black market players going to be funding any production in Venezuela? And that's, I think, an open question. As David mentioned, there are these deals signed by China. Concord is it? I always forget the name.
The CPPs, yeah.
China Concord Resources. But basically, I think those are going to be limitedly successful. By the way, and this with this I want to stop here. It also depends a lot of what the U.S. does in the black market, right? I don't think the bazooka that Secretary Rubio has to put 25% additional tariff to China is a credible tool to deter China. But of course, we have seen the Trump administration putting a lot of secondary sanctions to black market participants related to Iran. And so depending on how active the U.S. becomes in the black market, including with, for example, China Concord being sanctioned and things of that nature, we could see more or less appetite for this type of investments in Venezuela. Because in the end, the key is, are you going to get paid? Are you going to get your cargo, and are you going to be able to sell it and cash it in hard currency?
Thanks.
I largely agree with Francisco's take on Russia, but I think a couple of things to keep in mind. One is the primary motivation for China and Russia is geopolitical rather than purely commercial. So they want to expand their influence, they want to push us out, and they want to strengthen their own coalition. So Russia may have more of an interest in military sales to Venezuela, but they want to keep a foothold there. China is different. I agree that the big Chinese companies aren't as interested in this. They wouldn't take the risk, but this is really a service play for Venezuela. This is what these CPPs are all about. And you're talking about, yes, risking some money for capital expenditures and operating expenditures, but you're basically creating your own production, and you're keeping that production and you're marketing it yourself. So I think there is upside there. The big question is whether this is what happens to Chevron. And that leads me to another factor, which is, this is not a static situation. The question is going to be, how does Venezuela react to the expiration of these licenses? Does it believe that it's temporary, and will it therefore not be provocative in the hopes that they will be able to get back to a negotiation and a return? Or will they want to learn the lesson to some extent, which you've seen from China's reaction to Trump tariffs, which is that when you push back hard, he retreats. And so, in this case, they might decide to invite a Chinese company to sign a CPP to keep Chevron going, to keep that production up, and to move it out. So we'll see. I think the next couple of months will be telling. There's absolutely the potential there, though, I think, for them to keep that production going. And I think it's an incredibly lucrative deal. Under these CPPs, you're talking about keeping 50% of the production. It's like a 20% profit margin. And the Chinese players are kind of like everybody else who buys oil. How much risk do I want to take? Tell me what the netback is. And so the netback here is pretty high. It's a better deal maybe than Iran. And so I think the Chinese would be interested for geopolitical reasons, or even to trade that oil. I mean, I agree with everything Francisco said. Their decline may be flat, but you've got a lot of uncertainty. Will the U.S. tighten sanctions on Iran and make that oil less available, which China buys a lot of? Maybe, probably not. Will we tighten sanctions on Russia, and will that change the discount that China gets from buying a lot of Russian oil? Maybe, probably not. So And then does the economy, the Chinese economy, recover, and does demand pick up? Again, probably not. But I think, for the next couple of months, it's probably irresistible for the Chinese, it's irresistible for them to take a free opportunity to basically secure Venezuelan crude at kind of low risk and low cost if that opportunity is open to them. And I think that's the space we've got to watch. And that's where it's really in the interest of the U.S. to prevent that from happening by letting the companies keep an eye on their assets or keep them going in some minimal way, or at least keep them secure from being pillaged so that they can live to fight another day.
David, based on what you said, I mean, is U.S. companies withdrawing or being forced out almost a form of self-expropriation? Is that kind of where you're going with that comment?
Yes, I mean, especially if they are prevented from even being in the country or doing anything, then they are forced to walk away from these ventures, and they're abrogating in a sense, even by force majeure, their obligations. And so it's, as we saw, as Francisco pointed out, as we saw the last time, PDVSA will just step in and it will operate those. It may pillage, the assets, and there's an enormous amount of corruption that will return in terms of who gets contracts, but the workers are still there. Well, the problem is they won't have capital and they won't be able to buy a replacement compressor or spare parts, and that's where you'll see this steady erosion in production unless they sign one of these agreements so that somebody else is keeping that production up. So yes, I mean, this is, talk about an own goal. You force the Western companies out. You're handing billions of dollars of assets back to the Venezuelans and giving them one choice of a partner and who can help them keep things going. And that's the Chinese. We haven't talked about Cardon 4, and ENI and that Repsol project and things like that. But I mean, that's all the electricity for that part of the country. I mean, this is really, there are humanitarian issues, at concern there, but Venezuela cannot afford, to not have that operate. So somebody's coming, to step in and help that, because it'd be, there's probably regime stability, concern there. So, yeah, not just for the U.S. companies, but for the others, this is, it would be a huge own goal to force them out and not let them have any control, because it gives PDVSA every right to do what it needs to do to keep that joint venture going.
If
Thanks,
I may,
David.
Brian, I just wanted to mention that one key, of course, question we have here from here to Tuesday is if there is no replacement for the license, if there is no something similar to license 8,
Right.
there could be a legal limbo, sort of in which Chevron doesn't have, clear legal grounds, or sort of sanctions permission to remain to their assets, their equity shares, and that could open up, a kind of worms in terms of, Maduro saying, well, you are not complying with your contract, we can take over the assets. Of course, as both David and Elias mentioned, it also depends on the expectation. Is this going to be temporary? Is this going to be permanent? Because Maduro so far has been very careful, trying not to upset President Trump and do something, because they feel that there is a negotiation ongoing, etc. So that could change if they perceive this is the end of the game. So, I think there is an angle there that it is really interesting, because at the same time, nobody trusts each other here with good reasons, right? The Maduro administration has also the view from the Cubans that a U.S. government promise to a new world is not going to happen necessarily. And on the opposite side, Maduro has a very poor track record of keeping his promises. So it is quite a difficult situation to get a permanent, stable kind of long-term deal between these two actors.
Thanks, Francisco. I want to add one thing, and then Elias, I know I want to get to the chat, and I'm going to ask Elias to tackle a question or two in the chat, and I'll start weaving them in. We have 13 questions in the Q&A. I want to try to get through all of them if possible, in the spirit of what we do at academic institutions in terms of bringing all of these perspectives in. Elias, I'll kick it over to you. But one comment I wanted to make reference to what David and Francisco made. I did go through the painstaking process of translating China's recent national security strategy released earlier this month. Maybe not so painstaking because technology helps in the translation process quite rapidly. But I did notice one important theme in that national security strategy is the continued integration and sort of holistic approach at all sort of at least three domains: political, economic, and security, as being what informs China's approach broadly. And so in the United States, we have a tendency to separate economy and security and politics, in a foreign policy context to some degree. The Chinese, on the other hand, have been very calibrated in terms of their ability to integrate those things. And they also think over the long term, Western investors, 1 to 3 years, China looks at policy, over a longer period of time. And so, I think that, China has been very calibrated. They're still learning the ropes in terms of international, sort of international affairs to some degree, and particularly sort of operating in this hemisphere. But I do think the sort of tying of policy or politics, security, and economics together, keeps them focused on Venezuela, certainly in a contentious American foreign policy context, right? And so I think there is a thoughtfulness to their strategic approach to it that integrates those different domains in a very sophisticated way. And so with that, Elias, can I come over to you and maybe you start tackling a question or two, and then I'll weave in some of the others, and we'll see if we can't get through all 13 in the next 25 minutes.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I saw a couple questions about so what happens if, how can the Venezuelan government reassign Chevron's joint ventures? And actually, it doesn't have to do that. It doesn't have to change the shareholder in the joint venture. And if you look at the oil map, you see a lot of joint ventures, right? That they have an old shareholder. They're still there. They're not doing anything. And you have Perenco. I mean, I don't know. There's a whole bunch of companies that they're not doing anything, but they're still there. But then they don't get any profits from it. They're just there on paper. And we could very well have a situation where Chevron is a shareholder on paper, but they have nothing to do in Venezuela. And then this would either be operated fully by PDVSA. It could be PDVSA and some corrupt, well-connected Venezuelan businessmen. This has happened a lot, actually. Or it could be they could invite some kind of a production sharing agreement with a Chinese company or a company from any country. I mean, actually, if you look at the list of these CPPs, these production sharing agreements, you have a lot of unknown firms that you Google them and you're like, wait, hold on, what's this? And then you have different websites. You don't really know which one it is. You don't know if they're Swiss, Chinese, or German or Argentinian, and it's you're trying to figure out what's going on, and it's really difficult. And that's actually part of the executive as well, to make this really not transparent at all. So no one really knows. So who's to blame, right? If you're in Washington D.C., you're trying to put sanctions on Venezuela, and you don't really know what's going on, which players are involved. But yeah, I mean, eventually those Chevron joint ventures could end up in the hands of some other company. I mean, if you look at the big flagship project that ExxonMobil used to have, and that was actually expropriated by Chavez. Now it's run by a Russian company. It's not really Rosneft because of secondary sanctions, they had to kind of get a front company, but it's essentially Rosneft, right? And they're producing 80, 90,000 barrels per day in what used to be run by ExxonMobil. So yeah, I mean, it can definitely happen. ConocoPhillips used to have a big operation as well. Now it's been given to a kind of consortium between Brazilian investors and then a really well-connected Venezuelan businessman. So there's different ways in which these assets can be transferred. So, and then there's something interesting as well, how does the Maduro government respond to these sanctions? And actually, we've seen something that I didn't expect, which is that even though we're still within the wind-down period, the Venezuelan government said, we're not going to give Chevron any more shipments. We're not going to give them a single barrel of oil. And actually, you just loaded up 2 tankers. You have to come back, give us the oil back. and then we're gonna sell it to someone else. And this is something like, I mean, I really didn't think it was gonna happen, but I mean, it's happening, and that's part of the negotiation to say, look, if you're not gonna let Chevron operate here, we're not even gonna consider the wind-down period. Like we're gonna act as if you're gone already. And there was actually the big news that so you have this big field called Boscan that Chevron has been working on since like 1947 or something like that. And then from that, recently there was this new blend of crude called Boscan because it came from there. And then Reuters was reporting that this Boscan is going to China. So basically, the PDVSA, the Venezuelan oil company, said, "We're going to take your crude and we're going to sell it to China just to like shove it in your face."
Thanks, Elias. Okay, I'm going to try to get back to some of the other questions too. I know Elias touched on a few of them. I'm going to try to be somewhat systematic with it again, just to try to make sure I get through others. I'll ask our participants also, if you have opportunity, you see questions that you can answer quickly in the chats, just feel free to click type answer and you can respond to those while we're kind of weaving them in. But I do want to start with the first one. Aiden asked a question about diplomatic strategies, and I know, David, you kind of hinted on that in your opening remarks. What would a diplomatic strategy for the U.S. look like? And what would a timeline of diplomacy look like to achieve what I think universally what everyone wants, which is to see a restoration of democracy? You know, certainly those kind of on the American foreign policy side want to see democracy restored, but we have tensions over how and the timeline. So can you talk a little bit about diplomacy? Because you point out, absolutely rightfully so, nothing will happen without a degree of diplomacy being interjected in the process.
Yes, no, happy to. And I want to give a hat tip to Jeff Ramsey at the Atlantic Council. He and I are working on a piece for foreign policy, which will be out next week if the news will stop changing. Talking about what this pathway might look like. But I think it's worth noting that, as I mentioned earlier, that even the first Trump administration had talked about a democratic transition strategy. And that one did not succeed because essentially it required Maduro to hand over power to Juan Guaido, and so that was a bit of a bridge too far for the politics of those times. But it did fundamentally considered staged sanctions relief for democratic opening, and so I think really the very same thing is possible here. First, we have to get the frontline states, the neighboring countries involved, because that's where all those migrants are going. If the southern border is closed. And these sanctions will, this sort of relief and diplomacy would be more effective if we're in concert with others. And then I think the asks for this, the interim asks, are relatively clear. This is, stopping repression of dissidents, release of political prisoners, restoration of some of the independent institutions, a pathway towards more another competitive electoral conditions. And so it doesn't have to require Maduro to hand over power right away. So I think you can get those steps, which, I think are important because they give a presence and salience for the opposition to conduct itself in society, and it builds civil society at the same time. I think you can, you always in diplomacy want to do, you want to grant some relief based on verifiable performance. And then if you get that, then you can grant the next piece of release based on the next step. So you could come up with a roadmap where certainly within a year, you could see a number of these steps taking place, and the electoral conditions might be a little bit later. So I think that could happen right away. It's important to keep in mind that the sanctions relief also in this context is not a gift, simply to the Venezuelan government. As we discussed earlier, this is really the pursuit of U.S. interests to keep the Chinese out and the Russians and the Iranians out, and also to keep the country from having another massive humanitarian crisis from an economic collapse, because that does not promote political change. You want to disempower the government. So I think this could take place pretty quickly. And I think just in terms of the U.S. calendar, I think if we're looking at, sort of our budget process coming to some closure, in August or September, then I think as early as the fall, you can start to see a revision of the sanctions policy and negotiation of that roadmap. I think the challenge for the Rick Grinnells of the world right now is how do you engage with the Venezuelans on a future roadmap if your answer is just no. And this is where really those who want democracy in Venezuela have, very unproductively and unhelpfully kneecapped the ability to negotiate democratic change because you've taken, you've basically, closed the door on diplomacy. So that will be the challenge. I think some sort of a license for the companies would be a signal that there is a pathway back, the kind of thing that Francisco and I were talking about, a GL8. I think you could talk about the resumption of debt and other swap transactions, based on successful negotiations for the administration. That's probably regularizing migrant flights and accepting, the TPS Venezuelans back in there. So there are things the U.S. wants in the interim. I think that could start right away, but it really depends on, that initial signal from the administration that it's not hell no, it's just not right now. And that would provide the grounding for that kind of negotiation.
Thanks, David. And even that process of sort of some semblance of resuming or restoring democratic institutions, all these institutions have been purged over decades. And undoing all of that and bringing those institutions back into some form of, democratic rules of the game is going to take time, right? And could be a really messy process. Francisco, over to you on one question that Gilberto had about how much is produced with production sharing agreements and what percentage of that goes to contractors?
Well, most of these contracts are not working right now. They produce very little, but they have targets to increase production significantly. For example, Petrocedeño is there that is producing, I think, less than 10,000 barrels today, but it could grow. Similarly, it's Petro Zamora is, for example, there, a project that has been going back and forth. And now it seems it's going to be assigned or was going to be assigned on because it really requires a license to an American company. That some journalists say that it has ties to Mr. Sargent. I haven't seen that confirmed. But the bottom line is that it is at this point a minor level of production, but all of these fields have some potential. And I think I wanted to say something about this and mention something about what David said. I think that the key here is that there are some projects with low-hanging fruit, let's call them, right? They have the infrastructure, there are brown fields, they just require rehabilitation of some wells and maybe drilling some others, but everything else is there. Those are the ones with the most potential to get this type of investment that David mentioned. I think still they have this challenge that in the end, PDVSA is promising you that they will let you take some cargoes. But in the end, all the oil is sort of mixed together because these are mostly projects producing very little oil production right now. No? And so how will they get their money back? It requires PDVSA to really comply. Of course, in the short term, they will have incentives to comply, but the history is terrible about PDVSA, letting anyone get paid. The other thing I wanted to mention is that David...
Francisco, though, don't you agree that on the CPP model, though, it's 50% of the production. So in that, if it's as opposed to a production sharing agreement, if they use the CPP model, then essentially the company is paying for that, to do the improvements. They're paying the CapEx and the OpEx, but they're also paying themselves in oil. So they're not really relying on PDVSA, and they're not doing.
They are relying on PDVSA in the sense, David, that the initial production they have is very, very little, and so initially they have to put money. There is no way, but on top of that, they have to wait. If you want to accumulate into a 2 million barrel tanker to go to the black market from your own production, first of all, it's blended with PDVSA's production from other fields going to the terminals. But second, it will take months and months for you to accumulate one tanker. And so in the end, the question, David, that has been the problem for all the smaller players, except for Chevron, is that you cannot guarantee that you will get a shipment. You really need to trust that PDVSA is going to give you. And for example, Petro Zamora, they had a deal and they were not giving them the ships. And so that has been the struggle all the time for anyone risking. Of course, it could be a repeated game in which you invest a little bit, you wait, you see if PDVSA is giving you a tanker, and maybe then, you know, trust builds. But I think it's going to be challenging. But I wanted to mention something, David, about what you said. One of the biggest concerns I have is that I don't see in either the Grenell policy or the Secretary Rubio's policy a diplomatic path of negotiation. You know, one is emphasizing maximum pressure. The other one is emphasizing making deals for American companies. And a path to, you know, democracy or anything, even if it's as you say, Brian, a long-term path, I don't see it anywhere. I see two approaches that do not have an emphasis on, and by the way, in the case of Grenell, is very openly saying no regime change. This is not the business of the United States. So I hope we can get back in the debate what will be a diplomatic strategy for, you know, helping Venezuela regain democracy.
Could I come in like for like a little short? Yeah. I just wanted to come in and say like, yeah, that's true, that there's no like big, there doesn't seem to be like a big plan for Venezuela and for a transition from Washington, D.C. And because if you look at the first Trump administration, the idea was to like trigger some kind of like rebellion, a military coup and all that. And then you were going to have regime change. With the Biden administration, the plan was to do like a slow thing of having better electoral conditions over time. So in the presidential election, we're gonna like let Maduro win, but then we have a regional election with more rights for the opposition and that kind of thing, and eventually you get there. But now it's kind of, yeah, like as Manadi said, put pressure or just let them do whatever they want. And so I mean, and that's kind of something that I see a lot of opposition figures are realizing in Venezuela is like, wait, hold on a second, like all we did until now was rely on the United States to support us and to guide us, and now that's not happening anymore. And it's like for example, I mean, as I said, there's this regional election coming up on Sunday. Part of the opposition was kind of used to receiving US aid support, and now they aren't getting any of that. And then they were like, hold on a second, so we got to put like our own money, like from our own pockets, to finance the campaign. And then it took them a while to like realize that basically like no one's coming to help them, and that really sets a difference with what we had until Trump came in this January.
Thanks, Elias. Brian, I would just say, I mean, we've learned this lesson in U.S. foreign policy over and over and over again. Political change comes from within. You can create framework conditions, you can do institution building, you can be supportive, you can not be destructive. But the best you can do on the outside is create the conditions under which an indigenous, you know, a national population can create change. There is no deus ex machina coming, you know, even with sanctions. Forcing sanctions does not create that change, but diplomacy can help. And so, you know, I agree. If we're going to be serious about creating democratic change as opposed to just battling between congressional politics, and deal making, you've got to have a diplomatic strategy. But it's a diplomatic strategy based on creating conditions in the country which allow the opposition and the rest of civil society to be able to agitate and organize and participate. And you don't do that by bankrupting the economy and getting everybody to leave. So yeah, they got to get serious on the strategy and serious on the policy, and we're definitely not there yet.
Thanks, David. Francisco, maybe this question I can toss to you. Catherine asks if you have a feel for how Chevron and PDVSA are responding on the ground to the policy ping pong. I mean, you kind of alluded to it to some degree, but is Chevron, starting that process of thinking about where its assets are going to go? I mean, you have a feel for maybe the dynamic on the ground?
Yeah, imagine if you are in the shoes of Chevron. First, it seemed that the licenses were going to stay there. That was what was signaled clearly at the beginning of the Trump administration by Grenell. Then they get the Trump tweet. Then they get the cancellation of the license that the original, the license that they had 41, basically said that they had 6 months, even if the license was canceled. It turns out that they were given 30 days, no? And so, of course, that's very short period of time to wind down an ongoing project in which they were making significant investment. They had, I think the number that I heard is 300 different contractors, So that's a very challenging thing. Eventually, they do get the extension for almost 2 additional months until the 27th of May. But in particular, what made things more clear for Chevron that things that they had to wind down was the fact that even though there was the expectation of potential extensions and negotiations, that one day they were told not to pay the Venezuelan government, and the Venezuelan government told them, not only we're not going to give you any more cargoes, but give me back the 2 cargoes that you just loaded. And so that is when I think both contractors and Chevron itself thought, this is getting to a point in which we have to, think about the end. And so, of course, the last couple of days, we see again the ping pong starting. So it must be really difficult for them and for the contractors on the ground to know what's actually going to happen. But everything points out that if there is nothing changing from here to Tuesday and the license expires, it could be those 2 scenarios. In one, the 8th type of license would mean that they go back to what they had in 2020, and sort of they remain as shareholders, but they can do only minimal maintenance, and they cannot invest, they cannot receive payments, etc. In the other scenario is much more complex, because we don't know exactly what they will have to do in the scenario in which they don't get anything. But bottom line, there is a lot of uncertainty. I think clearly at this point they are winding down because the deadline is on May 27th, and PDVSA is planning to take over. And you already Reuters and others have reported, for example, that they have started changing what they do with Petropiar, which is the upgrader, to use it more for the domestic market, for the refineries. So they are going, PDVSA is already, and as Elias mentioned, they already are exporting the Chevron production to the black market, no? So PDVSA is, right? So what we're seeing is a gradual sort of takeover by PDVSA of the activities, that they already have a contingency plan clearly to take over the operation, and then they will figure out, if this is a more permanent or less permanent situation.
Thanks, Francisco. I'm going to ask some really quick rapid fire questions, see if I can get through a few more. I think maybe these have some short answers. Francisco, you mentioned it earlier. Is Venezuela still paying off its debt with China through oil exports? And how much is still owed on that debt?
This is a question that we don't have tons of visibility, and there are different estimates. But it seems that PDVSA has been paying, since El Aizami negotiated with China, a certain amount of oil that we can track, that is going actually directly from Venezuela to the Chinese NOCs, to CNPC's refineries. And that's about 40,000 barrels of the, more than 400,000 that go to the black market, or to China, sorry. But the rest go indirectly. So they are paying the debt down, but at a very slow pace, I think, with what was expected. And I have seen different estimates about the balance, but I think north of $10 billion are still owed to China.
Thank you. Who ultimately has the authority to announce the extension? Just for clarity purposes, so that we don't get our news from X. Who is going to be the institution that announces the extension?
Treasury.
State Department?
No.
Treasury.
Treasury.
The way it works is the State Department gives a foreign policy justification, generally for these actions, but it'll be issued by OFAC.
That's right. OFAC is the one that will have to make the final announcement through some type of press release or something like that, some public discourse. But again, that's important for clarity purposes, since Twitter seems to be the method of choice by a variety of thought leadership in our country in terms of putting that message out there. So I appreciate that. How can sanctions be redesignated or redesigned to target elites without destroying the private sector and middle class further? Is there a short answer on that one?
Essentially, it's what we've been talking about before, is you don't destroy the economy. What you do is you control the amount of money that goes to the regime. That's essentially what we have right now. You pay them in bolivars, you make sure the money is reallocated elsewhere, and you do other things. You don't allow them to travel, you isolate them diplomatically. You make sure they can't send their kids to school in Spain and other places. So, and you also, in your diplomacy, you point a pathway, particularly for the military, to survive when there is a democratic transition. You make it clear that that the elites in power may go, but the other institutions can survive, so that they don't have a stake in resisting change. I think that's the
one thing that I participated on a Venezuelan group, working group at the Atlantic Council, and in the past, we were asked to come up with ideas about how to change the sanctions regime in order to do exactly what the question asked. And one of the ideas that unfortunately is not popular because it recalls the oil for food program in Iraq is that, as David mentioned, you want to not strangle the economy, but at the same time, you wish you could force the government to direct the resources for humanitarian purposes. And so I'm sorry that this type of idea has sort of disappeared the discussion, because I think something in that line of thought could be much more productive.
Yeah, that's a great point. And addressing multiple issues, not just sort of the political, commercial dimension, but the humanitarian crisis as well, and how you weave those together. All right, I'm going to ask two more questions. One, Francisco, I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to ask a final question to all three. Francisco, I know you kind of referenced, or at least I've heard you talk about in the past. Questions: Will the Trinidad license be in a special category, potentially worth additional extensions given Trinidad's reliance on gas, or will it be lumped in with the rest of the oil licenses?
Sure. I think this is very interesting because these are very different category of licenses, right? These are for greenfield projects that are connected to exporting gas to Trinidad. Trinidad has a declining gas production and has a lot of spare capacity in their LNG trains. And so for Trinidad, this is a very important strategic thing to get the Venezuelan gas. And this will mean that these projects first have to be developed, and then the gas will start to flow, a couple of years from now. And then is when the Venezuelan government will get some money. Right now, they get almost nothing. And it's not at all something similar to the oil sector. It's much less revenues because gas is not only less profitable, but the government take is smaller. So I expected that this will not be canceled, because notice that in this case, you actually need a long-term license to even for any of these companies to really think about, doing a greenfield. In the case of BP, it's less clear because they will develop most of the field, almost all of the field on the Trinidadian side, so the risks are smaller. But just to close, one, of course, of the questions is, in an America First world, do the U.S. cares about what happens to Trinidad or to a couple of European companies? So that's, I think, a question mark. But I do think that the new Trinidadian government, which is more aligned with the Trump administration, will try to reopen this question again, because for them it's really, really important.
Thank you. All right, here's the last question. Elias, you take the first crack. David, we end with Francisco, and then I'll wrap up. I appreciate you guys staying over, and I appreciate the audience. We still have the overwhelming majority of the participants still on with us, so I don't want to miss the opportunity to ask this last question. So Samuel asks, is the goal to punish the regime worth the trade-off of losing leverage and visibility that Western firms provide? So this goes back to almost the beginning, the outset. What we're trying to at least discuss here and parse out is, from a policy perspective. But his specific question is: the goal to punish the regime worth the trade-off of losing leverage and the visibility that Western firms provide? Elias, you want to start? David and Francisco?
Yeah, I think the idea is to go back to the question, like, so what's the goal? Is it to punish the regime? Then yeah, if you blockade the country, you do punish them, or you punish the whole country and also the regime, right? But is this what the U.S. government wants to do? Like, is that their objective to say, you've been bad, I'm going to punish you, I'm going to like, I don't know, you know what I mean? Or is the idea to either create some transition or to make it easier, or I don't know, I mean, yeah, that's kind of the big question, right? So I think if there is a bigger goal of like achieving change, of okay, eventually we're gonna, if we do this, eventually we're gonna have like a pro-US government in Venezuela, then it makes, from their perspective of, right, like the US foreign policy perspective, it makes a lot of sense to okay, we're gonna do whatever we want, we're gonna make people suffer and all that, but we're gonna have a pro-US government on the other side. You could say that it makes sense. If it's just like, oh, you've been a bad boy and we're gonna like punish you, then I don't know what that achieves. Maybe maybe it's like a lesson for the rest of the world, like to be like, this is what happens when you mess with America. I don't know if that's what the White House wants to do, right? So if you lose leverage and you don't really achieve anything on the other side, then yeah, what's the point?
Yeah, I agree. Is it worth the trade-off? No. It's not punishment of the regime so much. It's really punishment of the citizenry. And what you lose by forcing out the Western companies, you lose the anti-corruption, you lose the transparency, you lose the independence, you lose, frankly, the 50% of every dollar, which ends up not going to the regime because it goes for reinvestment or it goes for debt, and you lose that, depriving them of hard currency. So you lose a lot, you gain very little. So no, not worth the trade-off in my view. And this is why I would just add, poll after poll, data analysis, and some of these other people's show how unpopular the sanctions are really across the entire country, not just with the regime supporters, but a lot of the independents and, and so many even of the opposition. And that's because it's just bad for the country and it's not effective.
Thanks, David. Francisco.
Yeah, I think the issue in the end is that the US government has some carrots and some sticks, and it has to find a long-term coherent policy that includes, what do you do with the black market? I don't think the threat of secondary tariffs is gonna be effective in that area. So, and it's becoming harder to, do anything in the black market, but, are they gonna do anything there? And of course, the biggest way for engagement is offering some potential benefits to access the licensed markets, in particular US, Europe, and India. And so, but again, to me, the biggest problem is of course, there could be a strategy that I'm not seeing anywhere, and this ping pong might be a good cop, bad cop strategy. But so far, I don't see, a strategy of using these tools for a purpose of any kind. And so that is what concerns me. I have seen in the past at least some idea of what they were, attempting to do. I see today a divided administration that doesn't have a strategy, and that's, I think, a big concern.
Francisco, Elias, David, thank you all so much for joining us today for this discussion. I thought it was incredibly thought-provoking, and I appreciate the candidness that you brought to the discussion today. There's no doubt that this is going to remain a very complex issue. Whatever comes in the coming days is probably at best going to remain temporary, while the U.S. tries to find some degree of sense of longer-term policy approach to how we tackle our policy towards Venezuela, while maintaining that policy in the context of the broader geopolitical competition that's going on for U.S. strategic interests. And so, again, we're probably going to have many more of these, and so I'm going to invite you all back at some point soon to continue to parse through these dynamics as they continue to evolve. I'll tell our audience to be cautious about getting all of your firsthand information from Twitter. It's going to be bouncing around just like the policy is, and so wait for the official statements coming out from the formal bodies and authorities that have the responsibility to put that information out there before we start to bake it into parlance. And with that, again, thank you all for participating, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.